Hello, Elevate fans. Welcome to season 7, episode 4, or at least the recording of season 7, episode 4. What media should Catholics avoid? Another interesting topic. They're getting more and more interesting with each season as you guys come up with new ideas and vote on them. So I appreciate that. Keeps me on my toes. Um, this is a particularly interesting one, and hopefully I can give you some insights as to how Catholic teaching on media consumption has evolved over the centuries and how it's really evolved in the last 60 to 80 years, specifically since Vatican II. So strap in. It should be a pretty quick and easy one, and hopefully it meets your need. So as always, let's begin with prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, thank you, as always, for bringing us together, giving us an opportunity, giving me an opportunity to explore different elements of our faith and what they mean for us in the life we live in our current age. Help us all take some of the church's advice relative to media consumption to heart. I think it's valuable advice. I think it's important advice that we need to share and extend to others. And just give us the grace to always use prudence in our media consumption and help our children and family and friends do the same. And we ask this in your holy name, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So again, this is interesting. I get this question a lot. Is it okay if my kids watch this? And then I get, from adults, is it okay if I watch this? Or, is this a problem? Is this dangerous? What do you think? And a lot of that is just asking for a subjective opinion. So I was quite happy to see that this was a topic that was raised. It comes up pretty often. And it gave me the opportunity to kind of dig into where has the church stood on media from its very beginnings. And hopefully it will give us some advice that we can all lean on and follow as we progress and get exposed to more and more different media channels and forms. And use it for the good that it was intended to be used for, as opposed to the evil that it can sometimes lead us to. So what we're going to cover today is, what is media? Okay, what counts as media in the past and in the distant past, the near past, the present, where we're going with media. What has been the church's role in media consumption, in regulating it or promoting it? Excuse me, I see a picture falling down here. Or commenting on it over the centuries. What has changed, the 20th century evolution of the church's view of media, and that has led obviously into the 21st century, and what's happening there, what's current teaching on media consumption and use, and then just get to the bottom line question: how do you know what you should and should not consume? What are the rules of the road to live by? So hopefully we can outline a few of those and make this a valuable and productive session for you. So let's talk about what is media. So it's fluid what is considered media in today's age. Okay, so there are new channels. Channels just mean the way that media is delivered to us, being created as we speak. Okay, so there's constantly new forms of existing channels. There's new channels, completely new channels. There is now and just an enormous amount of content that's being produced for various channels specifically. What we are subjected to today is just an inundation of information and a seemingly limitless number of means through which we can access that information. But that was not always the case, clearly. So, in the ancient world, the written word, which really evolved, within the last few thousand years, would have been a channel. But visual arts, music, and more frequently, just basic oration in the public square, I call it. But just, word of mouth, oral tradition, and passing on of stories and things of that nature. These would have been the primary forms and channels for most of modern civilization up until the 20th century. So, visual arts, music, probably some of the oldest, along with oration. Written word a little bit later in ancient history, but certainly played a major role in preserving content and ensuring that content could be easily passed down and disseminated. So, that's really where we were. We talked about media, that's what we meant really up until the late 19th, early 20th century. And in between then, there was one major jump, and this happened primarily in the 15th and 16th century. So the 15th century saw the perfection of the printing press, so that it was now possible to mass produce written documents or images at a reasonable price. Okay. And up until really then, the 14th and 15th century, really, I mean, the 15th and 16th century, apologize for that. That was simply not possible. So, as a result, very few people could read or write because there wasn't a great need for it. There weren't many books in circulation. Not that there weren't a large number of individual manuscripts, but copies were very limited because producing a copy was prohibitively expensive. Even something as short as a gospel, okay? So think about how short the gospels actually are. Would have cost several $1,000s in today's money to produce a single copy in the first century. And that didn't change all that much as we got into the 15th and 16th. And then it did change. The printing press basically turned everything on its head. That and the introduction of a reliable method of paper production. So that came a little bit earlier, but the printing press actually took advantage of the fact that there was a media available to print on that was now cost effective, sturdy enough, and could be rapidly reproduced. So the printing press comes in, all of a sudden books are available to anybody, okay, at a reasonable price. Pamphlets and flyers became a very common means of social communication, very much used by political and social activists. Magazines and newspapers erupted, became the normal means of accessing news, of accessing current events, and of expressing public opinion. So huge jump in that 15th and 16th century. But not much after that, not another huge jump until we get to the late 19th, early 20th century with radio being the first big jump. And then motion pictures, movies, followed by television, followed by the internet and video games. Okay, and you're going to say video games, where does that come in? Yes, video games are a form of media. There are definitely messages being transferred, especially in today's video games. There are social agendas being acted out in those games. So we need to actually think of them not just as a form of entertainment, but as a way of passing on and indoctrinating people into certain belief systems, just as movies and television and radio and the content you see on the internet has been, and I think you more easily recognize. Video games fall into that pattern as well. So you have this 19th, 20th century explosion of media through these various means, a massive jump from the written word to the visual written word on demand, anywhere, anytime, any place. That was something totally radical and really changed who was producing media. We started to see the shift from, initially it was large scale news and entertainment organizations producing most media content, with artists continuing, as they always have, producing the visual arts. But all of a sudden, as we got to the late 20th century, the number of content producers exploded exponentially because you have the internet, because of the ability for anyone to post anything, anytime, that was reachable by anyone. Okay, so it really changed the whole scope of what media is. And by the way, actually, is the cause of many arguments that continue to this day. Does that really count as media? What is that? And but quite frankly, I think that you'd have to argue that yes, it is a form of media, a very individualistic, in the olden days would have been a private form of media distribution, has now become very public. And then with the 21st century and the eruption of social media, and the proliferation of smartphones and the whole concept of electronic subscription and notification, and now more recently, artificial intelligence curation of your content. It's been another major jump in what we see, how we see it. The algorithms that have now been developed to push information to us based on our consumption of media. It's become an extremely complex environment, and in some ways quite a bit overwhelming, and can be overwhelming. And data shows that, yes, for certain people, today's media environment is really causing them a lot of psychological distress. And we see this quite frequently now in studies that are coming out specifically on what is happening to the brains of young people because of this media saturation, and some of the content that they are being curated, or that's being curated for them. So again, it's been a real game changer here, and it continues to change at a very rapid fashion as we continue through these early decades of the 21st century. So, media's come a long way, but what's the church's historical role in media consumption? And quite frankly, pre-printing press, there really wasn't a big role for the church, and part of that was there wasn't a lot of media consumption because people couldn't read, they couldn't write, so the written word was out. Reproduction of visual imagery was prohibitively expensive as well, so they didn't get a lot of visual media messaging. Again, people couldn't afford it even if it was there, so access was limited. We didn't have museum systems and public libraries and things of that nature where people could go and get access to large volumes of disseminated information. So primarily it was word of mouth. It was oration in the public square, literally. The town crier was your primary source of media, and whatever the editorial board in that town crier's brain was producing or allowing you to hear is what you heard. So in a large part, the church was a big part of that because people would come to church on Sundays, and that was a form of media consumption in an odd way, through the homily, through the ability of a priest to offer a social commentary relative to the gospel on current events. So, that was really the primary role. Now, that being said, I will tell you that the church did get involved in media monitoring very early, long before the printing press. But, it really wasn't a major concern of the church, only because media consumption wasn't a major player in anyone's life. Again, the printing press changes everything, okay? As it just, again, it almost overnight, we have a literacy explosion, and access to printed materials and reproduced materials just became so cost effective that literally there were very few people that were shut out of that access, and so much was being produced, especially in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, in pamphlet form and flyers and one-pagers that were just distributed everywhere. You could say it was almost like an explosion of content for the people in specifically the 16th century that witnessed that explosion. However, like I said, the church has always been involved in regulating content to an extent. So primarily its focus was on denouncing what the church would deem as heretical writing. So heresy is the obstinate denial of a divinely revealed truth. So if someone wrote a treatise on the Trinity that basically disputed the reality of the Trinity and proposed maybe a quadrinity, which was an early heresy that put Mary in there as the fourth member of the quadrinity, the church would actively ban the reading of that and the production of it. And the church had a big influence, obviously. So if they said, "Hey, no, I don't want anyone reproducing this, you scribes, you copyists," it simply wouldn't be reproduced through normal means. So that goes way back to the very early centuries of the church, where the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council, actually produced a couple of canons that did indeed ban certain heretical writings, primarily those of Arius, which were quite damaging to our understanding of who Christ is in relation to the other two members of the Godhead. So that was early on, and that continued all through the antiquity and the early Middle Ages, the mid Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages. And it's because the religious leadership really saw as their duty and their role to help safeguard the purity of the faith, so make sure the faith remained orthodox, and protect the souls of the faithful who could be easily swayed by reading something and just assuming that because they read it, it was true, which, by the way, we still do today. People every day send me questions. I read this on the internet. When did the church start teaching this? And the answer is never. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. So this is not a new problem. This has been going on forever. And back then, the popes and the bishops were primarily the only ones really in a position to have the influence to actually say, hey, guys, no, you should stay away from this, or yes, this is good. So they played that role, and they played it pretty well, okay? And that lasted real well until we had the Protestant Reformation, or the Protestant Revolution, as is probably more apt. And all of a sudden now you had an explosion of heretical documents, okay, and heretical books. And with the printing press now being available, this being now the 16th century, all of a sudden the church had a much bigger problem on its hands to try to make it clear to the Catholic faithful what was sound content and what was not. Paul IV, he was the first one to really say, okay, it's time we construct a list of the good and the bad. His Index Librorum, okay, the prohibited index, the list of prohibited books, was first produced by him, and it was extensive, okay, in 1559. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at what he was banning, it was probably quite a bit over the top, okay? Maybe not in his context, but even in his context, other bishops and apologize for that, a little late here. Other bishops and church leaders said, "Hey, I think you might have gone a little bit too far here," and we saw that adjustment made almost immediately. So that was 1559. Just 5 years later, at the Council of Trent, they modified the index. Okay, so they took about 2/3 of its content out and said, "Hey, these books aren't." On their own evil. And they also then laid out some rules for what would be included on the index moving forward. So certainly heretical and superstitious writings, those are good. Let's just get rid of those. And keep in mind, the index, the intent was not just so the faithful knew what not to read, so that printing houses knew what not to print. And they did use this as a guideline for whether it could be printed or not. There was always underground printing mechanisms and things of that nature, but from the mainstream printing houses, they knew that if they were asked to print a book that was on the list, the pain and suffering could be tremendous because the church could basically put them out of business. So as the primary consumer of printed materials, it had a pretty large sway. So anything heretical and superstitious, immoral books, okay? So really, it had to be pretty obscene. It wasn't just like, hey, minor immorality. It had to be pretty, hardcore. So borderline verbal pornography, with some exceptions. The church recognized that some of the Greek classics, which can fall into that category in certain places, have such tremendous value from an antiquity perspective that they said, no, those would be okay. But they did put in a restriction saying, but please don't share these with people who aren't mature enough to handle it, okay? And then they put a final rule in that just said, any Latin translation of the New Testament produced by a heretic is no good. And that was specifically targeting a couple of individuals that had produced some highly suspect Latin translations of the New Testament, which actually changed significantly some of how the New Testament would be interpreted, if indeed those were ever used. So they had a specific point on that one. And then not much changes. So from the 16th century through the 17th century through the 18th century, the index was maintained and it was actively used. As nation states evolved, specifically in the 17th and 18th and early 19th century, the influence of the church started to wane. Up until then, the church was the primary unifying power. And I'm grossly oversimplifying what the Western world looked like at the time, but it was a pretty potent force. And as nation states evolved, the potency of the church devolved, as did the papal states. At one point, the church was its own nation. The papal states would be one of the larger countries in Europe if they still existed today. But by really the end of the 19th century, that was it for the papal states. And at that point, you also had the end of the church's high level of influence on media consumption. It was more now a government regulatory issue than it was a religious or social or moral gateway issue. Then we get in the 20th century, things start getting a little hairy. So you have radio, you have movies, the early elements of television are beginning to evolve. And what we're seeing produced, what started out, especially on radio and movies, for those of you who do not know, most of that started out actually as a source of publishing religious materials, okay? Or at least, most of the early movies had a religious theme, reenacting a major element of the Old or New Testament. And you saw a lot of this on radio as well. It was a way of getting out a religious message, a form of religious education. And, the church really funded and guided a lot of that early media development because it was so valuable as a way of catechizing people and getting information out about the faith. However, by the 1930s, some more risque movies started to slip out. And when I say more risque, I would say the early forms of pornography were out and unregulated. So you had the Legion of Decency, which certainly wanted to regulate extreme cases like the early forms of pornography, but also wanted to regulate some other movies that were really contrary to the orthodox understanding of morality. Okay, so movies that showed people or at least gave people the hint that there's such a thing as sexual activity outside of a marriage bond would fall into this category. And there were quite a few of them. All right. So you had the Legion of Decency. It was a grassroots movement that really started here in the United States. And it was really battling those directors and producers of films that were really, going not just up to the line, but well beyond the line of what was then considered common decency. And it was very, very effective. They actually put out a statement, and I've copied a piece of it here. No film, it was really focused at the filmmakers at the time. No film that lowers the moral standards of the spectators, which cast discredit upon natural or human law, which arouses sympathy for their violation, should be allowed. And then through boycott, which is what they used as their method, boycotting movie production studios and movies in general. The Legion of Decency, which was a cross-Christian movement, was quite effective, actually. They, if you don't have Christians in the early 20th century going to movies, you have no one going to movies. So if Christian leaders are saying, don't go to this one, it could really damage a movie production house quite substantially. So the church, both the Catholic Church and the Christian ecclesial communities, had a pretty good vehicle through their assemblies to really put pressure on the movie industry. And so much so that it actually produced something called the Hays Code, which was, strangely enough, controlled to some extent by the Catholic Church, which really clarified what could and could not be produced. You see an image of a piece of it on the right-hand side of the screen here. But the Hays Code was basically before the current movie rating system. The Hays Code was the method of ensuring that a movie could or could not be produced. And if you violate any of the Hays Code, your movie could not be distributed. It was as simple as that. Now, the Hays Code was pretty good, but the Pope is sitting back in Rome and seeing that the Hays Code is good at stopping things from getting out there, but the amount that is now being produced that is questionable is escalating quickly. So Pius XI, first off, wanted to recognize the good work of the Legion of Decency and continue to ask Catholic bishops to promote that work and support that work, but then also ask the bishops to be diligent. So this document, Vigilante Cura, was really important. It was the first time that a papal encyclical was written specifically addressing media consumption. We've had the index for years and years and years, centuries actually, but now we're talking about different forms of media. We're beyond books. We're into movies and radio and public performances. So some of the visual arts outside of movies and television. We're starting to really get into areas that the church felt were detrimental to the holiness of its people. So you see Vigilante Cura is like the Pope urging the bishops to remain vigilant, okay, and to actively encourage or discourage, whatever is necessary, the faithful relative to media consumption. Then, a couple decades later, now we're at Pius XII, Pius XI's successor. He is actually writing once again, and this time he's recognizing that, okay, things have really gotten worse since Vigilante Cura was introduced. And we need to educate the consumers, specifically the Catholic consumers. Oh, I see a typo. I want to fix that. I'm going to pause for a moment. Hold. All right, let's do that one again. I realized there was a little typo there. So Pius XII, says, hey, things have gotten worse in the last 20 years. Again, he calls on the bishops to be vigilant, but he also makes another call. And this is an interesting little change in the Catholic messaging. He's actually calling out to Catholic producers and actors and saying, you are responsible for your work. And in an interesting way, this was all part of an evolution on the church understanding of how you cooperate with evil, whether it be formal or material cooperation. And if it's material cooperation, whether it's remote or proximate, that thinking was evolving at the same time. And they're recognizing that, hey, you guys who are producing this stuff, you are responsible, okay, and will be held accountable from a moral perspective for the impact that this stuff has on people and their ability to continue to develop their union with God. So a little bit of a change here from Pius XII, really targeting the people that are producing the content as well as the content itself. But not much, I think at this point, as they say, the horse was out of the barn. And what you end up having is this becomes one of the major topics of the Second Vatican II Council, and one of the 16 core documents of the council was produced specifically to address social communication and what the modern state of social communication was here in the early 60s around the world. So, that decree had three major elements. Recognize the power of the media to influence and serve, saw the good that can come out of media. Certainly encouraged the church. So this is 1963 saying, hey, we should be using it. We should be out there and using all forms of media to get the good news message out. Let's not just, count on people showing up on Sunday and preaching. Let's develop our own newspapers and radio and television. And to some extent, we had been doing this. It's not as if the Catholics had their head in the sand. So there were Catholic newspapers and magazines and media outlets, but Inter Mirifica, it actually said, no, let's now go. Let's really make it happen. And you could see one of the results of this was the dawn of what is today's EWTN, by Mother Angelica and her start of that media network, which now it crosses all sorts of channels and massive amounts of content. But that was a big part of what Vatican II wanted to do, saying, look, we can, it's one thing to discourage the consumption of bad media, but it's another thing to actually produce good media and give people an opportunity to choose the good. So that was big. And then also said, it's also recognized there is bad media. So not all knowledge is helpful or good. And that was a big theme of Inter Mirifica as well, is that there are such things as, bad communication, all right? And as the 60s progressed, by 1966, again, horses out of the barn, we discontinued the index of banned books. Said, at this point, reading is actually in decline. So, our bigger issue is radio and television and movies now. But it was discontinued. And then, unfortunately, 1968 also saw the end of the Hays Code. So, people had been going up to the edge with the Hays Code, maybe a little bit over the edge, through the 50s and into the 60s. By the late 60s, that edge was broken off, and the Hays Code was no longer being recognized or even being given lip service to. So, but the movie industry itself did recognize, well, we got to have something. If the Hays Code is falling to the side, maybe we need something else, and that's where you ended up getting the Motion Picture Association of America ratings, which have changed drastically since then, but or at least an attempt to give people a heads up of the type of movie that you might be seeing when you walked into a movie house. All right. So some significant changes there in the 60s. Now, Intermiffica, really lays out some ground rules for Catholics. And, I'm just going to highlight this is article or paragraph 9 in Intermirifica. And if you want to get Intermirifica, you can. It's not that long. You can just go to the Vatican website. If you just typed in Inter Mirifica in Google, it would bring you to the Vatican website, and you can download it in any number of languages. I happen to download it in English, but it's only about 5 pages long, so it's a pretty easy read. Okay, but it has some pretty important elements. So avoid those forms of media and that content which could be the cause or occasion of spiritual harm. Okay, so things that could lead you to sin, you should avoid. If you know that, for example, when you see movies that depict people acting immorally, if you know that the impact that has on you is it lowers your moral standards, well, stop watching those type of movies. Okay, it's pretty simple advice. And if you see other forms of media leading people away from God into dangerous avenues, yeah, fight against that as well. And anything that's promoting evil, clearly, let's fight against that. So that was a big part of Intermifrica, calling all Catholics now to be vigilant. But then Mirifica also explicitly addressed parents, and this has not changed. Parents have a most serious duty to guard carefully. Okay, the principal moral responsibility may fall on others, but parents, you are responsible for safeguarding your children. Now, the church then go and double down on Pius XII statement. The principal moral responsibility for the proper use of media and social communication. And then they listed everybody, falls on newsmen, writers, actors, designers, producers, displayers, distributors, operators, and sellers, as well as critics. So pretty much anyone related to media production, distribution, or commentary, the church is now saying is going to be held responsible and should be taking up that responsibility for ensuring that the content is a positive and not leading to a deterioration of moral standards and undermining civilization itself. It also goes on and makes another very interesting statement, actually creates a rule for the Vatican to live by and the rest of the ecclesial hierarchy to live by, basically saying from now on, starting with Intermirifica, we are going to every year produce one day or have one day where we dedicate to really talking about media and the consumption of media, the impact on the faith lives of Catholics, and providing some advice and counsel. So again, and they're saying at least one day a year you need to advise your faithful on some of the latest and greatest advice and counsel to ensure that they stay on the right path to salvation. So this was important because this actually produces a series of papal documents, and we've seen them with the last the last 5 popes. I only have 4 listed here because John Paul I, was only in office for less than 30 days, never had an opportunity to produce a pontifical world communications address. But Paul VI did for 11 years, and John Paul II did clearly for over 25 years. Benedict did for his 7 years in office, and for the 10 years that Francis has been in office, he also has produced one of these. And some of them are quite striking. As a matter of fact, this one from 2023 really deals with social media, and it goes into a great deal of detail. So if you're looking for a guide on social media consumption, this is a pretty good one. Okay, so this is 2023. I'm just trying to think who produced it. So yeah, so this comes from the prefect of the dicastery for communications. But you can just search for this title, Towards Full Presence, a pastoral reflection on engagement with social media. Yeah, you can see dicastery of communication produced it. Very useful to check that out. Okay. So the church has not been just sitting idle by. They have been looking at the scientific studies that have been done on media consumption and the influence of media on primarily youth, which is a major area of study, but on all of us. And they've been active in voicing their informed opinions, and they are informed by a team of experts. So these are actually all pretty good addresses to take a look at, especially the more recent ones. And Francis has actually put out a couple of really good ones. Unfortunately, no one ever reads any of this stuff because the media has no interest in it. So you're not going to hear about it in the news. You're not going to, it's not going to be something that's brought to your attention. But I would encourage you to read at least, one or two of Francis's more recent world communication addresses. And I think I can actually show you. Let's see here. Pontifical World Communication Day address. Okay, let's look at that. Generating. Great. Yeah. Okay. So you can Google that and get to Francis's world communication addresses. Okay. And you can see you can download them in multiple languages. And then if you wanted to get to others, we go back to Francis. We can go back to Holy Father. We can say, hey, I want to see what John Paul II wrote. So I go to John Paul II, and I believe it's going to be under letters. Oh, maybe not. Audiences, no. Homilies, letters, messages, speeches. Let's see. Here we go. World Communication Day. So you can find it for any of the popes. You can see their particular messages, and some of them are quite good, actually. And you can see how the church's message has changed a little bit over time. So just so you know, they're out there, they're available for you. I encourage you to read them, okay? And then the current teaching of the church on media consumption is pretty simple. It kind of follows Inter Mirifica. So information provided by the media is at the service of the common good. So church believes that the media has a responsibility to serve the common good, and that the information that they promote needs to be based on truth, freedom, justice, and solidarity. Blah, blah, blah. Content and communication needs to really be, again, set by justice and charity, and should recognize the moral law and legitimate rights and dignity of man should be upheld. Dignity of man is a big part of media consumptions. We want to make media consumption. We want to make sure that, whatever media is produced, it is portraying and helping humans live up to the standard of being made in the image and likeness of God, being sons and daughters of God. And that's a big concern with the church, because too often media has actually dehumanized humans and objectifying humans, if you're talking about pornography and things of that nature, and radically portraying what things can and cannot legitimately be done to our fellow humans. And that's where the church's big concerns are. And those concerns go on, to the users, users of media. Okay, don't just be passive. This is another church message right out of the catechism. You need to practice, which means you actively take a role in moderating and disciplining your approach to media, and work to form your conscience. We are all responsible for forming our consciences. So we can't just say, well, my conscience said this was okay. If you ever put any effort into forming your conscience, you're going to follow your conscience right to hell, okay? It's the message of the church. So, form your conscience and use your conscience to resist some of those things that can actually lead you or be a near occasion of sin for you. So again, the example I used before, if in let's use art, okay, because art is always a very difficult area. But if you look at some more risque art, and that leads you to thoughts of lust and objectification, stop looking at that art. Okay, that's the simple answer. The church is saying you need to listen to what your brain is telling you, and where your brain is then leading you when you consume certain media. And if it's leading you away from God, stop. Okay. And then the church does again go back, and church has always done this, and says, hey, look, you civil authorities, you have a responsibility. The reason you exist is to maintain and protect the common good. And the church does believe that the governments now are the only people in position to actively censor, and we hate to use that word censor, but what's wrong with it, quite frankly, to censor those materials out that are not in the best interest of the public good. Okay. And people are like, wait, that violates freedom of speech. And keep in mind, the freedom of speech doesn't mean you can say anything you want. It means that you can say anything you want right up to the point that you're damaging someone else. Okay. And that's when it becomes actually criminal activity. And we recognize that in the United States around our freedom of speech, that it is not an unlimited freedom. It is a freedom to speak things that do not and are not designed to damage others. Okay. So public authorities need to make sure that they are on top of that. And they need to make sure that misinformation is not passed on and fake news is not passed on, and really calls those authorities to the table. And I think to some extent, most countries have taken that to heart. I don't think because the church said it, but I think they recognize their role there. But the standards are constantly changing, and some would argue devolving. And especially in this country where we have these rights that we spout out without really thinking about them. We're very sensitive to any restriction on media content. And I think maybe we should not be as sensitive. Okay, that's a little Chris opinion there, but that's also where the church is going, is that there are some things that should actually be censored and regulated, and others that should not. And then, finally, the church will say, hey, use your prudence. Okay. Prudence, if you've developed the virtue of prudence, it can help you, determine what is good and what is bad for you individually and for others collectively, and avoid it or boycott it, or try to fight against its distribution. So developing the virtue of prudence is very important from the church perspective. So, coming down to what you should and should not consume, well, Inter Mirifica says it's best. Okay. For those things that are good, yeah, go for them. And then, avoid those that could be a cause or occasion of spiritual harm, or lead others. I think that's the bottom line. If it's leading you or has the potential to lead others who may not be as mentally strong or confident or formed as you into sin, well, that should be media we avoid and media we fight to ensure is not widely distributed, or distributed at all if possible. So I think Inter Mirifica, really gives you the best advice, and it hasn't changed. That advice still sticks. Coming on 60 plus years later from when it was first issued. And the simple rule is, if it's leading you and others closer to God, you should consume it and support it. Okay. If it leads you or others away from God, you should avoid it and work to ensure it's not available to others as well. Okay. And that is a subjective rule, but in this case, some subjectivity is going to have to be used. There is no objective standard, even when it comes down to pornography. The government has been struggling with this for 50 years. And the best answer that anyone's come up with is, well, you know it when you see it. Okay, so it is a subjective rule, but that's the rule we all need to follow. If it's leading you closer to God, it's good. If it's leading you away from God, it needs to be avoided and regulated and censored if necessary from those who could be disrupted by it. So not an easy task, a lot of gray area there. But again, I think each of us individually can ask ourselves that question. If reading this book, watching this movie, regularly binging this television show, is this leading me to God, or is it undermining in some even small way my relationship with God? And based on the answer to that question, you have your answer to what media you should and should not consume. So, is watching Harry Potter movies okay? It depends. Okay. So let's give it. If you watch the movies understanding they're purely entertainment and seek to highlight the good within them, so you're looking at the self-sacrifice that's demonstrated in there, the ultimate victory of good over evil, the need to fight evil, the good of the many outweigh the needs of the few. That's great. These are great themes that come out of those movies and come out of many great movies that are made today. However, if when you watch them, your desire for the reality or that magic be real, your desire to dig into the occult is stimulated by watching these movies, and that's leading you away from the truth and God, then don't watch them. Okay, so it really depends on each individual. So clearly, some things, pornography objectifies everyone involved, and is damaging on so many levels. That's a clear one. But when you get to movies, I think you're going to have to use your individual, again, prudence to determine if it's leading you closer to or away from God. And for those who are parents, you have a special role of applying that same prudential judgment to what your children consume. And you are responsible for applying that and doing so as wisely as you can. So, is it okay? It depends. Sometimes for some it may be, for others it may not be. And we just need to be cognizant of that, and recognize that we all have a role to play for ourselves individually and for the members of our family and friends, okay, or for those people that are family and friends. And then again, governments should regulate. We should encourage our governments to do that. I know that a lot of people are afraid of that. Government's going to blacklist everybody. No, not really. And when those things happen, the world has an amazing history of correcting overswings. I think what we have in the situation we're in today is we've overswung to the wrong side. And we have really denounced regulation of any type, and I think that people are starting to wake up to the realities that maybe it's time to regulate and censor a little bit more for the common good, and that's what the role the government should be playing. Obviously, if we're in class, we'd probably have a little discussion, a couple of questions. I'm looking forward to seeing what the class comes up with. I'm recording this a couple of days before the class will be given live, but I hope you guys found this information interesting. I hope it encouraged you to go look at some of those pontifical documents. The shared drive, I'm going to pop a few documents out there you may have interest in after viewing this. So if you do not have access to the share, please send me an email at cmorris@hforange.org, and say you want access to the Season 7 Elevate share. But I will be putting those things out there, and I encourage you to consume them, and that will help you develop your own right judgment, your own virtue of prudence, and that will lead us down a good path. So let's end in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, thank you for the guidance that you have your church give us. Thank you for giving us, though, the two great strengths you have, which is intellect and will. So we have the ability to determine and judge and evaluate and learn, and we have the ability to decide for ourselves. We ask that you really help us hone in on those abilities, especially when it comes to media consumption, both the content and the quantity, so that we always use that one simple rule that if it's leading us towards God, it's good. If it's leading us away from God, it's not. And use that to regulate ourselves and regulate those that we are responsible for. We ask this in your holy name. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thanks, folks. This was fun. Let's do it again.